age drowned in shadows, Roman cities collapsing, roads abandoned, trade fading away, and people slipping into ignorance, living in fear, clinging only to religion. It's the story told again and again in textbooks, in novels, and on the big screen. A Europe after 476, swallowed by the darkness of forgetting. But as new fragments from the past emerge, they force us to ask, was this entire age really nothing but darkness? The answer doesn't come from official chronicles, but from fragile scraps of paper that once seemed worthless. A personal letter about a salt route, a small monastic chronicle from Brittany, a faded trade record in Venice, or a hymn of triumph hidden within a Bible. These quiet whispers reveal another story, one that official history has often chosen to overlook. In tonight's episode of Bedtime History, we open the door back to the past and listen to voices thought to have been buried for centuries, the voices of what we call the Dark Ages. And what they tell us is not just collapse and despair, but resilience. Through tiny records, monastic chronicles, personal letters, trade accounts, we discover a different story. One of human endurance, of sparks of knowledge, commerce, and culture that continued to shine in the midst of upheaval. As we step deeper into the world of whispers from the past, one of the most reliable and enduring sources we find are the monastery chronicles. Inside cold stone walls in scriptoria, lit only by the dim glow of candles, monks patiently wrote down lines they never imagined would become treasures for the future. To them, it was simply a daily duty. Record which year brought famine, which season had heavy rains, which king had died, which abbot had been installed. Yet it is precisely this steady, seemingly dry routine that preserved the heartbeat of an entire age. These chronicles were often nothing more than brief, yearly notes, sometimes just a line or two. This year the crops failed. A comet appeared. The Northumbrians attacked. Simple words, even trivial ones, but strung together, they tell us about climate, disasters, wars, and plagues, the forces that shaped the fate of entire regions. From there, modern historians can cross-check with archaeology, geology, even climate data to rebuild a much larger picture. A single plain sentence can open the door to an untold story. What makes them even more fascinating is that monastic chronicles didn't just record major events. Many also reveal the mindset and worldview of the people who lived then. An astronomical phenomenon like a comet was often read as an omen. A drought might be described alongside prayers or rituals of penance. Here we see the blending of reality and belief, of nature and the supernatural. Reading those lines, you almost hear the whisper of a community, fearful of uncertainty, yet determined to explain and endure. Some chronicles also give us a surprisingly detailed glimpse into the economy and daily life. One record from Corbie Abbey in 8th century France, for example, mentions a shortage of wine in winter that forced the monks to substitute it with beer brewed from barley. A small detail, perhaps, but behind it lies evidence of climate change affecting crops, proof of flexibility in daily practice, and a reminder of just how central agricultural products were to religious life. Notes like these break apart the frozen image of the Middle Ages, showing us the complexity and change woven into everyday existence. And sometimes, these simple notes capture world-shaking events with astonishing calm. That year, the city burned. The king's army was defeated. No commentary, no drama, just bare fact. This stark minimalism compels later readers to fill the silence with research and imagination. Monastic chronicles are like foundation stones. They don't build the whole house, but without them, we wouldn't even know where to begin. Occasionally, their simplicity opens a door to wonder. An Irish chronicle from the year 774 notes, "There was a bright light in the sky, shining like day, lasting through the night. Only in the 21st century did scientists connect that entry with carbon-14 evidence in tree rings, concluding it may have been a massive solar flare. What was once just a curious note, scribbled by an anonymous monk, turns out to be a witness to one of the rarest cosmic events in Earth's history. This shows us something profound. Monastic chronicles don't just reflect what communities saw and experienced, they sometimes preserve natural events that went far beyond their imagination. They are archives that never knew they were precious, written only to remember, and yet it's this very humility that allowed them to survive as a steady rhythm of history. Of course, these chronicles have limits. They often carry a religious lens, written by men whose lives were spent inside cloisters, rarely noting the details of common life beyond the monastery walls. But that bias is itself revealing. It tells us how the spiritual elite viewed the world, how they defined meaning in events. When we compare those records with trade documents, personal letters, or other local accounts, a layered, complex picture emerges, contradictory at times, but immensely rich. That is why every time a new chronicle is discovered or deciphered, historians treat it like a key unlocking another door. From trembling lines on parchment or faded ink on vellum, the Middle Ages no longer look like a dark void. Instead, they emerge as a network of events, beliefs, disasters, and deeply human experiences. If monastery chronicles give us the steady heartbeat of an entire community, personal letters bring us close enough to feel the breath, the worries, and the emotions of individual lives in the Middle Ages. While official histories usually focus on kings, wars, and dynasties, letters reveal another world, a world where personal concerns, intimate relationships, and the hunger for knowledge were carried on fragile sheets of paper. A single trade letter from the Mediterranean in the 11th century reveals a whole cross-border economy. The writer carefully lists bales of linen, sacks of salt, and bags of pepper to be shipped, while reminding his partner to keep his word and pay on time. This wasn't a dry administrative record, it was a lively conversation where ink took the place of a handshake. In those words, we see proof that medieval Europe was not cut off, but deeply connected to the outside world through commerce. Beyond trade, letters also reveal the emotional life of the age. A wife writes to her husband far away, asking him to bring back a small gift for their son, or simply sending him a few words of concern. On the surface, they seem simple. But between the lines are love, worry, and longing. And when we read them centuries later, we realize something timeless. The deepest concerns of the human heart, family, affection, missing the ones we love, have never changed. Many letters also open a window into the world of knowledge. Scholars exchanged thoughts on translations of Aristotle, debated questions of theology and logic. These weren't formal treatises, but written conversations, personal, sometimes messy, always alive. Through them we see how knowledge still travelled, carried on scraps of parchment over mountains and seas, linking thinkers from Ireland to Italy. What makes medieval letters remarkable is their diversity of voices. Some were written on fine parchment, neatly penned, sealed with red wax by nobles. Others were scrawled hastily on scraps, a peasant's shaky hand sending a plea to his landlord. Together they form a layered picture where not only rulers leave their mark, but ordinary, nameless people speak in their own voices. Letters also reveal a quiet transformation, the birth of modern languages. A single page might begin in proper Latin, then slip into a few lines of a local dialect. In these moments, we witness French, Italian, and Spanish slowly carving out their space alongside classical Latin. And then there are the letters that were never sent, found, tucked away in estates or archives. Confessions never spoken, feelings too fragile or fearful to be delivered. These scraps carry loneliness, yearning, and abandonment, a deeply human experience that feels strikingly familiar, even across 1,000 years. Through these fragile letters, the Middle Ages no longer seem like a mute, voiceless era. Instead, we hear the whispers of merchants, scholars, mothers, fathers, wives, and husbands. They tear down the wall of prejudice that paints medieval Europe as nothing but submission and silence, and reveal instead a world where people still loved, still thought, still wrote, leaving behind the most human legacy of all. If personal letters bring us close to the breath of individual lives, trade records open the doors to a very different world. These aren't hurried notes or tender words, but documents that look stiff and lifeless, filled with numbers, signatures, and clauses. And yet, out of this dryness, we find some of the strongest evidence for a truth official history often overlooks. Medieval Europe was not stagnant. It was an economic body in motion, its lifeblood pumping through trade and contracts. In the archives of Venice, Genoa, or Bruges, thousands of contracts have been preserved, each one recording the details of a transaction. One document from the 11th century shows an Italian merchant borrowing money to buy goods for transport across the Mediterranean, with a promise to repay principal and interest within 6 months. Behind these seemingly dull lines lies an early credit system, proof that people in the Middle Ages were already using financial tools to expand trade. They borrowed, signed contracts, mortgaged property, and even created clauses for compensation when risks arose. In other words, they laid the foundations for banking and maritime insurance, things we usually associate with the modern age. But it wasn't only big deals that left a paper trail. Local records reveal countless small exchanges, cloth for beer, wood for iron, or even salt used to pay workers. One Flemish contract spells out 3 rolls of cloth for 2 barrels of beer. Another, from northern Italy, records wheat traded for olive oil. Strung together, these tiny agreements sketch a layered economy, from village swaps to continental trade routes. These everyday exchanges show us the real pulse of medieval life, a rhythm often hidden from epic tales of kings and battles. Equally striking is the presence of law in these transactions. Most contracts included witnesses, seals, and responsibility clauses. If goods were lost on the road, the carrier had to compensate. If a borrower failed to repay, property could be seized. Many port cities even set up their own commercial courts to settle disputes. Far from being lawless, medieval society had a strong legal framework, crafted by communities themselves to protect trade. These weren't just business deals, they were proof of a society capable of order and self-regulation. Trade records also highlight Europe's international connections. A Venetian contract shows a merchant striking a deal with a Muslim partner in Egypt. A Bruges document records the presence of Hanseatic merchants from the Baltic. Behind every number lies a sea route, a caravan, a cross-border link. Medieval Europe, far from being closed off, was already a node in a global network earlier than we often imagine. Some records even reflect changing social tastes. When a contract lists the purchase of cane sugar, a luxury item recently imported, at many times the price of wheat, we see shifting desires. Spices, sugar, and fine crafts weren't just necessities, they became status symbols. These pages don't just tell us about trade, they reveal the rise of a consumer culture in its earliest form. Of course, opportunity came with risk. Many contracts included clauses of general average. If a ship sank and goods were lost, the damage would be shared among multiple parties. This was the seed of maritime insurance, an essential innovation in a world where every voyage might be the last. Those harsh lines of ink remind us of fragile ships on stormy seas, where merchants gambled both their fortunes and their faith on signatures written in ink. Crucially, these records also show us social structure. Who was allowed to sign contracts? Who could serve as witnesses? In many cases, we find women, especially widows or nuns, participating in trade, sometimes even lending capital. Details like these overturn the stereotype that women were entirely excluded from economic life in the Middle Ages. So when we hold one of these ancient contracts, we're not just reading cold legal terms, we're listening to the heartbeat of a society that knew how to negotiate, commit, and share risk. These documents turned trade from a matter of chance into a sustainable system. And from trade, we're led to another dimension, law. For law in the Middle Ages wasn't just about transactions, it defined rights, obligations, and the order of society itself. If trade was the lifeblood of medieval Europe, then law was the skeleton that held the body together. In the popular imagination, post-Roman Europe is often pictured as a lawless wasteland, where the strong ruled and the weak could only submit. Yet the legal texts that survive, from land deeds and wills to written codes, tell a different story. Medieval society was anything but chaotic. It operated within a dense web of rules, sometimes harsh, but at times surprisingly humane. The simplest documents we find are land contracts. A deed from the 9th century might be just a few lines. Person A grants this land to person B in exchange for 3 measures of grain and labor during the harvest. Witnesses signed, date, wax, seal. Behind that brevity lay a legal framework. Land wasn't held only by sword and conquest, it was bound by agreement and written into memory. A contract turned vague power relationships into concrete obligations: who owed taxes, who offered protection, who received the harvest. These scraps of parchment show us a society that knew how to organize rights and duties, even in times of upheaval. Inheritance was just as important. Many medieval codes spelled out exactly how property was divided, which share went to sons, daughters, widows, and under what conditions. The famous Salic law of the Franks, strict as it was, still carefully outlined how family wealth was preserved. In Italy, records even show women keeping land after their husbands died, or in some cases, signing transactions themselves. This detail challenges the common image of medieval women as completely shut out of economic power. Law, even in its inequality, still carved out small spaces for negotiation and survival. One of the most striking innovations of medieval law was the concept of vergilde, the price of a person. Instead of letting feuds spiral into endless cycles of revenge, the law set specific sums of compensation for every injury. Theft of livestock, bodily harm, even murder, all had a price. It may sound cold, but this system restrained violence. Instead of endless bloodshed, communities chose compensation to end hostility. It was a mechanism of order and of reconciliation, and the deeper we go, the more we see medieval law wasn't just the law of the strong. Many rulings carry a surprisingly human touch. One 11th century case from a small town records, "This family cannot repay their debt in full. If forced, they will starve. Therefore, half the debt is forgiven, so they may live." Another city statute stated, "The price of bread must remain reasonable, lest the poor rise in revolt from hunger." These texts reveal law not only as a tool of control, but also as an effort, however modest, to keep society in balance. Of course, the law wasn't always fair. Many codes imposed harsher penalties on peasants than nobles, punishing the same crime with unequal weight. Law preserved order, but also exposed inequality. And that is precisely why it feels so real. It shows us a society negotiating between ideals of justice and the realities of power. What mattered most is that law created a shared memory. Every deed, every ruling, every copied code became an anchor for communities to cling to. Even when kingdoms collapsed or wars broke out, those commitments survived, invoked, repeated, remembered. Law, in this way, became the collective memory of the age. And when we place these legal records alongside personal letters, trade documents, and monastic chronicles, we see the truth. The Middle Ages were not a lawless void, but a labyrinth of rules, rigid yet flexible, unjust yet humane. Law was the invisible skeleton that kept society upright, preventing it from dissolving into chaos. Medieval law, with all its complexity and flaws, was both shield and mirror. It shows us that people in this era weren't only warriors or subjects, they were also negotiators, willing to bargain and compromise in order to live together. And while those stern texts held society in place, another world, softer, more emotional, was being written in poetry, legend, and stories filled with humanity. In the world of medieval literature, words were no longer just a tool for recording laws or transactions. They became a way for people to bare their souls, to share wisdom, and to dream. And it's in these writings that we see most clearly that the so-called Dark Ages were anything but silent. They echoed with voices of all kinds, from clumsy verses scribbled in monasteries to fables, legends, and love stories. Most of these works never made it into official history. They survive in scattered manuscripts, in notes scribbled in the margins of Bibles, in bundles of parchment left forgotten for centuries. And yet in these fragments we find a literature of ordinary people, far less polished by political or religious agendas. A short poem in the margin of a Bible captures a monk's homesickness. A handwritten fable teaches children a lesson about honesty. A ballad tells of a knight lost on the road home from battle. Individually they are shards, but together they form a vibrant mosaic. Especially in folk tales and local epics, we glimpse a lively world of imagination. Anglo-Saxon texts speak of heroic warriors, dragons and monsters, but they also carry deep notes of grief for loss and exile. In Old French literature, the songs of Roland or the Knights of Charlemagne aren't just tales of glory. They wrestle with loyalty, honor, and betrayal. Beneath the armor of epic poetry, we find very human struggles. As relevant as any literature of later ages, many works blurred the lines between philosophy, theology, and art. Some writings asked, can human reason truly grasp God's will? Others praised nature at once as hymns to the divine and personal outpourings of awe before beauty. Here we find a depth of thought that the label dark ignores. Monks, scholars, and poets weren't only copying texts, they were writing new chapters in the cultural story. One of the most striking aspects of medieval literature is its linguistic diversity. While chronicles and legal texts were usually written in Latin, literature increasingly appeared in local tongues. Old French, Old English, Middle High German, they began to find their voice, bringing writing closer to everyday people. This shift was a milestone in the birth of national literatures. A love song in rustic French, a folk ballad in Welsh, these weren't just works of art, they were markers of cultural identity taking shape. Among forgotten manuscripts, we sometimes find unexpected gems. Medieval fables later inspired La Fontaine. Ballads recovered from faded copies helped shape Chaucer and Dante. Works once considered small and anonymous quietly laid the groundwork for Europe's greatest literary voices. Even in darkness, seeds were being planted, waiting to sprout. Other texts offer glimpses of daily life in literary form. A shy love poem about exchanging apples in the market. A handwritten joke about a gluttonous monk. A harvest song about summer wheat. Through them we see peasants, merchants, and craftsmen not as background figures in legal texts, but as protagonists in their own stories. Medieval literature didn't just reflect reality, it also gave people meaning and hope. During plagues or wars, writings often carried a tone of comfort. Stories of saints who healed, poems likening human life to the cycles of the seasons, reminders that after the long winter, spring would return. These pages were small flames, keeping alive a faith in the future. And from these fragile works we realize darkness is a false perspective. This was, in fact, a time when cultural pillars were being built. Vernacular languages, folk traditions, new literary genres. Without them, the Renaissance and the modern age would have had no foundation to rise from. These forgotten voices, once recovered, rewrite the history of culture, proving that literature's fire never went out, it was only hidden. Literature was not just a place for dreams, it was also a doorway to deeper questions. How does the universe work? Why do humans exist? How far can reason travel alongside faith? From this yearning to reach beyond the page, philosophy and science began to stir, quietly, persistently, but with a force that would not fade. In the monasteries, alongside copying the Bible, many monks also preserved and annotated the classical works of Greece and Rome. Aristotle, Boethius, Cicero, Galen, these names survived the centuries thanks to the patient hands of medieval scholars. But they didn't just copy, they interpreted, debated, and sometimes even adapted the text to fit their own world. A commentary by a 9th century monk, for example, might quote Aristotle on logic and then insert his own reflections on the relationship between reason and faith. In this, we see that medieval thought wasn't mindless repetition, it was a living dialogue between past and present. Science, though in its earlier stages, was far from absent. In medical manuscripts, we find the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, but also the first-hand observations of medieval physicians, records of plagues, descriptions of symptoms, even experiments with local herbs. Some texts reveal a fascinating blend of classical medicine and folk knowledge, using native plants for healing alongside prayers. This fusion of science and faith, however imperfect, was the groundwork on which modern medicine would later build. Astronomy, too, left its mark. Monks recorded solar eclipses, comets, the movements of planets. At first, this was simply to fix the dates of religious festivals, but over time, their observations became invaluable data for historians and scientists today. A manuscript from Fulda Abbey in the 9th century, for instance, recorded the sighting of the aurora borealis, something modern science has since confirmed with independent evidence. What once looked like shaky ink on parchment is now priceless scientific testimony. Medieval philosophy also reveals a hunger to reconcile reason and faith. Thinkers like Augustine and Anselm asked profound questions. Can the existence of God be proven through logic? Does natural knowledge conflict with divine revelation? These debates were no less deep than those of ancient Greece, only framed within a religious context. And it was precisely this tension that fueled growth, shaping scholastic theology and philosophy, the intellectual foundation of Europe to come. It's also important to remember that many scientific and philosophical texts reached Europe not only through monasteries, but through Islamic and Byzantine bridges. Translations from Arabic into Latin reintroduced Aristotle, Avicenna, and Averroes to the West, opening new horizons. But these works weren't simply copied. They were argued with, reinterpreted, and adapted. A 12th century monk in Paris might study Aristotle through an Arabic translation, then critique him from a Christian perspective. This was intellectual exchange across borders, proof that knowledge was never completely sealed off. Among the forgotten manuscripts are simple math problems, notes on arithmetic and geometry, evidence that education never completely died out. In many places, children learned to count, to write, even the basics of logic. The trembling lines of a student's notebook, sometimes with doodles in the margins, have survived as reminders that rational thought still lived, even in its humblest forms. All of this forces us to reconsider the old stereotype. The so-called Dark Ages were not an age where people stopped thinking, but an age where they fought to preserve and reshape knowledge in a harsh world. Their persistence across thousands of manuscripts stands as proof of an enduring intellect, laying the groundwork for the breakthroughs yet to come. While knowledge quietly smouldered in monasteries and schools, people were also chasing it across distant roads. Curiosity didn't live only in books. It pushed feet to wander, leaving behind travel journals and maps that were clumsy but filled with the fire of discovery. We often imagine medieval Europe as a continent closed in on itself, locked in fear. But the words and sketches left on parchment tell another story. It was an age of constant movement when merchants, pilgrims, and even nameless wanderers stitched together lands that seemed worlds apart. Among these texts, merchant diaries stand out. A small notebook belonging to an Italian trader in the 11th century records his days on the Adriatic, the price of dried fish in Ragusa, the shifting of monsoon winds, the fear of pirates. On another page, he describes the sunset at a Byzantine port where goods from Asia and Africa poured in. These scattered notes let us picture a Europe that wasn't still but breathing in rhythm with a global pulse. Alongside them are countless pilgrim journals. People walked to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem. Along the way, they wrote about villages, inns, encounters and dangers, disease, robbers, storms. But mixed with hardship was wonder. A 12th century pilgrim from England described in vivid detail the spice markets of the Mediterranean and the grand mosques of Islam that he saw for the first time. For him, the journey was not just spiritual, it was an opening of the eyes to a wider world. Medieval maps, though far from accurate by modern standards, reveal something profound, how people imagined the world. Some were drawn as circles, placing Jerusalem at the center, with Europe, Asia, and Africa radiating like petals. Others filled distant lands with strange symbols, monsters in the north, endless rivers in the east. Behind the fantasy lay a hunger to organize the unknown, to tame fear by drawing it. And some maps, surprisingly, were accurate. The Vetus map from the 8th century shows the Mediterranean and Nile with striking clarity. The Hereford map of the 13th century, though laced with legend, reflects expanding geographic knowledge gained through trade and pilgrimage. This proves that imagination always ran alongside a steady effort to collect real information, passed on from travelers and written down for future generations. Travel diaries also bring us priceless glimpses of daily life. A Flemish merchant describes paying a ferryman with salt instead of coins. An Italian scholar complains in a letter that the inn where he stayed served only hard bread and sour wine at twice the price of Venice. These little gripes, trivial as they seem, bring the Middle Ages to life more than any chronicle. Together, these texts remind us that even in so-called darkness, Europe was wide open to the larger world. Italian merchants traded spices with Egypt. English pilgrims reached Jerusalem. Norse explorers rowed their ships all the way to North America. Every journey was dangerous, but all of them prove one truth: human curiosity never stopped at the border. And with maps alongside travel diaries, we see imagination and intellect walking hand in hand. A map was not just a tool, it was a statement about how people saw the world. Vast, complex, but still possible to capture with ink and line. Placed next to the philosophical, scientific, and literary texts of the time, these works remind us that medieval thought wasn't trapped inside monastery walls. It ventured outward, across the world, leaving its mark on every page of worn parchment. But now, after seeing this mosaic of economy, culture, philosophy, and exploration, we face a challenge. How do we decode all these texts? Languages shift, symbols fade, and the contexts are long gone, posing a daunting puzzle for modern researchers. Few tasks are as painstaking or as patient as sitting for hours, even days, before a sheet of faded parchment, trying to trace letters worn thin by time. Behind every line we can read today lies sweat, weary eyes straining in lamplight, and the dedication of linguists historians and archaeologists, those who turn themselves into bridges between past and present. Language is the first obstacle. Medieval Latin was far removed from classical Latin. It blended local dialects, shifted sentence structures, and introduced whole clusters of new vocabulary. A sentence that looks simple might carry 3 or 4 layers of meaning, and a single mistranslated word could change the entire context. On top of that, many documents were written in the earliest forms of vernacular, Anglo-Saxon, Old French, Middle High German, languages that today only a handful of experts can truly decode. Every misspelling, every regional variation can turn into a labyrinth. The second obstacle is handwriting. Monks, merchants, and students all wrote in different styles, the neat strokes of Carolingian script, the dense tangles of Gothic, or the quick, slanted scrawl of commercial notes. Sometimes a single manuscript holds several hands, layered by different scribes, and time has only made it worse. Ink smudged, parchment cracked, letters fading like ghosts. Decoders must learn to see through the blur, comparing thousands of samples to reconstruct the original form. Often they face palimpsests, parchments scraped clean and written over. Beneath the new ink linger shadows of the old. Each page is like a double painting, and scholars must use microscopes, ultraviolet light, even digital imaging to peel apart the layers. At those moments, deciphering a manuscript feels like excavating geology, new layers burying the old, and the researcher patiently uncovering them one by one. Then there is the cultural distance. A tiny mark might mean something entirely different than it does to us today. A cross-shaped symbol might be an accounting mark, a period, or a religious sign. A line reading "the land was granted to the community" could mean very different things depending on local law. Without the right context, translation risks serious distortion, bending whole histories out of shape. And many texts are incomplete. A commercial contract missing half a page, a chronicle scorched at the corner, a letter with only its opening lines intact. Scholars have to piece them together like puzzles, cross-referencing other sources, making educated guesses. The work is part science, part art, requiring caution but also imagination. Yet it's precisely these difficulties that make the work beautiful. Every restored character is a doorway opened. Every translated sentence is a step closer to the past. When researchers bring back to life a forgotten line of poetry or a legal clause long erased, they aren't just translating words. They're translating memory. Sometimes a tiny detail, the price of pepper, or a marginal exclamation, can overturn our entire understanding of an age. Today, technology helps. Multispectral scanners, artificial intelligence, chemical analysis, all reveal words once thought invisible. But in the end, it still takes human hands and human minds to grasp context, to place words in their rightful flow of history. Deciphering is not just technique, it is a fusion of linguistic knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and historical intuition. And here lies the remarkable truth: the past was never completely silent. It only speaks in a language that requires patience to hear. The struggles of deciphering are not barriers, but challenges, tests of our endurance and our hunger to know. Once we move through the fog of language, symbols, and time, we begin to see the hidden light beneath the dust. And that is when archaeology joins voices with text, working side by side to rebuild the fuller picture of an age we have too long known only through prejudice. If texts are the voice of the past written in ink, then archaeology is the voice of the past spoken through stone, broken brick, shards of pottery, and human bones, and only when the two meet does a fuller picture begin to emerge. Manuscripts tell us the price of salt or the fear of pirates. Contracts reveal trade. Poems capture feelings. But archaeology, with the silence of objects, confirms, challenges, or expands what the texts leave behind. It's through this partnership that the very idea of the Dark Ages begins to crumble. Take trade, for example. Documents often record salt, spices, and textiles, but only when archaeologists unearthed Arabic coins in northern Europe, Indian peppercorns in a 9th century German grave, or Chinese porcelain in the port of Venice did we grasp just how global the economy really was. Behind every dry line of ink, the artifacts prove that trade routes truly stretched from Scandinavia to the Middle East, from the Mediterranean to Asia. Archaeology also illuminates daily life, the details many texts pass over. A monastery chronicle might write, "This year the harvest failed," but when archaeologists uncover charred grains, furrows in ancient fields, or iron farming tools, they can pinpoint the reason: harsh climate, flooding, or drought. These traces flesh out the narrative, turning vague reports into concrete stories with causes and consequences. Architecture tells another tale. Written sources often describe invasions, but the remains of fortified walls, towers, and sturdy gates reveal resilience. Towns like York in England or Lucca in Italy weren't simply destroyed, they rebuilt, reorganized, and kept urban life alive. These ruins directly challenge the stereotype of a Europe reduced to scattered, lifeless villages. Archaeology even reveals cultural diversity. While religious texts tried to impose unity of faith, cemeteries tell another story. Graves show a mix of Christian and folk practices, sometimes combined. Amulets, bronze mirrors, and non-Christian grave goods appear alongside crosses. This evidence paints a far richer, more pluralistic spiritual landscape than the monochrome vision the Church wanted to project. In some cases, archaeology has confirmed details once dismissed as legend. A chronicle might mention a strange light in the sky, and when matched with carbon-14 evidence in tree rings, scientists now know it was likely a massive solar flare. A manuscript may describe a plague, and archaeological analysis of teeth reveals traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death. Archaeology, then, doesn't just illustrate texts, it transforms vague words into scientific data. Sometimes, though, it contradicts them. Chronicles may claim a city was completely destroyed by raiders, yet excavations show life continuing, even thriving, just decades later. A text might declare total decline, but artifacts, jewelry, tools, finely crafted goods prove a surprising level of prosperity. These clashes remind us that history doesn't speak with one voice. It's an ongoing dialogue between ink and earth. Together, text and archaeology bring the past closer to us. When you read in a traveler's diary about a bustling market, then stand in a museum and see the scales, weights, and pottery dug up from that very site, words turn into tangible reality. When a poem describes the countryside and archaeologists uncover plough blades, cowbells, or terraced fields, we realize that poetry wasn't fantasy, it was reflection, and it's through this partnership that we see clearly. The Dark Ages weren't absolute darkness, but a blurred picture waiting to be brought into focus by both words and artifacts. And now, as the fragments begin to align, we hold in our hands a tool more powerful than ever before. Modern science, digital imaging, chemical analysis, artificial intelligence, all of it is transforming the act of reading the past into nothing less than a revolution of knowledge. If texts give us the written voices of the past and archaeology speaks through stone and bone, then modern science opens an entirely new doorway. The past is no longer read only with the naked eye, but decoded through invisible light, chemical traces, and even the algorithms of artificial intelligence. In the hands of researchers, these tools have turned the study of the so-called Dark Ages into a high-tech journey, where even the smallest speck of dust can tell a story. One of the most important breakthroughs is multispectral imaging. Manuscripts once blurred, erased, or overwritten, palimpsests unreadable to the human eye, are now revealed under infrared, ultraviolet, or X-ray light. Old ink, scraped away centuries ago, suddenly reappears. Thanks to this, hundreds of texts once thought lost forever have been brought back. A famous case is a manuscript of Aristotle in a Sinai monastery. Biblical text was written over it, hiding the classical work. But with multispectral imaging, the Greek philosophy shone through again, an echo across 1,000 years. Chemical analysis has also become indispensable. By studying the composition of ink, researchers can determine age, origin, even the trade networks that supplied the materials. A drop of ink might reveal it was made from minerals in Spain, proof that the manuscript itself once traveled along wide trade routes. Even parchment analysis reveals secrets, which animal it came from, how it was treated, and what that says about the society that produced it. These details transform a manuscript from mere text into a living artifact rooted in culture and economy. In archaeology, radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis have revolutionized how we date and understand life in the past. A piece of wood, a grain of wheat, a fragment of bone, all can tell us the exact time period and climate conditions. Cross-checked with monastic chronicles or travel journals, this data confirms or corrects the written story. A line reading, "That year the harvest failed," can now be matched to tree rings showing drought or isotope evidence of malnutrition in human remains. Perhaps the most dramatic advance is ancient DNA. The teeth of plague victims from 14th century cemeteries revealed traces of Yersinia pestis, confirming the Black Death as fact, not legend. DNA also reconstructs human migrations, shifts that medieval texts often mentioned only vaguely. Suddenly we see the Dark Ages not as stagnation, but as an age of constant social restructuring. Artificial intelligence has added another leap. Today, AI can be trained to recognize medieval handwriting, classify letters, even suggest readings for damaged passages. Work that once took a scholar a lifetime can now be accelerated in months. But AI doesn't replace humans. It widens their vision, letting researchers focus on meaning and context. This quiet partnership is reshaping the field of history itself. Digital technology takes it further still. Manuscripts can be scanned in 3D, cracked pages restored, faded letters enhanced, then shared globally for thousands of scholars to study together. Archaeological sites can be digitized, allowing us to walk through ruins without leaving home. The past is no longer locked in archives, it has become a living library, open to all. Yet these advances bring new challenges. With so much raw data, how will we read the past? Is there a danger of reducing history to lifeless numbers, stripped of human depth? Or is this an opportunity to unite science and the humanities, to measure and to feel at the same time? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear. Modern tools have turned the Dark Ages into one of the most dynamic frontiers of historical research. Every hidden line, every trace of ink, every grain of dust now has a voice, if we listen with both technology and imagination. And it's at this point that we reach the most thrilling moment, when early findings sharpen into focus, when unexpected details surface from translations and analysis. It's the moment we get our first glimpse of what was once unknown, truths so striking they force us into silence because they directly challenge what we thought we knew for certain about history. Perhaps the most moving moment in this entire journey doesn't lie in the patient labor of decoding, nor in the dazzling power of modern technology, but in that instant when we first see what was once unknown. It's the moment when faded letters, broken artifacts, or lifeless numbers suddenly come together to reveal a new truth. A moment when history, long thought immovable, stirs, opening a door to something entirely different from what we believed. Imagine a researcher, after months spent over a blurred manuscript, finally realizing that a single key word in a trade ledger doesn't refer to salt, but to pepper. Just one word, but it shows that by the 9th century, pepper from India was reaching Europe far more regularly than we ever assumed. That tiny discovery doesn't just add a footnote to economic history, it rewrites the way we understand medieval trade, proving that global networks continued to thrive even in an age once labeled dark. Other revelations strike us with their intimacy. A seemingly ordinary letter, once fully deciphered, turns out to contain a hurried love poem scrawled in the margins, the handwriting clumsy, the lines trembling, but the feeling sincere. Even in the rigid world of the monastery, human affection spilled beyond rules. A single fragile moment like this shatters the stereotype of a Europe filled only with fear and obedience, showing instead that people still longed, still dreamed. Sometimes the surprise comes from archaeology aligning with text. A chronicle might report, that year the sky burned bright through the night. Once dismissed as superstition, it now matches perfectly with tree ring data showing a sudden spike in radiation, evidence of a rare solar flare. The instant when old ink and modern science converge, history suddenly feels alive again, not distant myth, but a real event that touched the earth and the lives of those who saw it. Other findings reveal unexpected complexity. Recently decoded legal documents show that by the 11th century, some Italian cities already had commercial courts with procedures, legal advocates, and trial records. This flies in the face of the idea of a lawless medieval Europe. It forces us to see that within the so-called chaos, islands of order already existed, nurturing the legal spirit that would shape Europe's future. Some discoveries even carry a poetic beauty. In a manuscript of sacred hymns, researchers found a short, almost hidden musical fragment. Just a few notes, perhaps the scribe's idle doodle. But when musicologists reconstructed it, they discovered it echoed uncannily with a folk tune still sung along the Rhine today. A thread of melody stretched across 1,000 years, quietly proving the continuity of cultural memory. And sometimes revelations overturn old assumptions. A 10th century land contract from the Rhineland shows that a widow could retain ownership of property, contradicting the long-held belief that medieval women were excluded from inheritance. Another record from a monastery reveals that students were encouraged to debate their teachers rather than simply repeat their words. These small details crack open the rigid picture we thought we knew, revealing a society more diverse, flexible, and at times progressive than we imagined. What matters most is this: these breakthroughs rarely announce themselves like scientific revolutions. They are usually small whispers rather than thunder, but strong enough to make us rethink an entire chapter of history. For history, in the end, isn't shaped only by battles or decrees, but by countless everyday details we've too often ignored. And as these details accumulate, a new picture emerges, no longer a Europe shrouded in darkness, but a continent quietly in motion, preparing for transformation. Each unexpected discovery adds another brushstroke until the old narrative of a straight line from darkness to light collapses. In its place, we see a rich, interwoven tapestry. And it's from here that the act of rewriting history becomes not just possible, but inevitable. This is not about tweaking a few details in a textbook. To rewrite history means to reimagine entirely how we've pictured the so-called Dark Ages. For centuries, that image has been shaped as an age of ignorance, decay, and stagnation, set in opposition to the light of the Renaissance. But as hidden texts and archaeological finds continue to prove otherwise, that old framework no longer holds. History must be told not as a neat sequence of darkness and dawn, but as a complex current where shadow and light are always intertwined. One of the biggest shifts lies in economics. For a long time, we believed Europe after Rome fell into poverty and self-sufficiency. Yet trade records, contracts, and excavated artifacts prove that networks of exchange continued to thrive, from the Mediterranean to northern Europe, from local markets to the Silk Road. What we see is not a collapse, but a restructuring. Trade moved from centralized imperial systems to flexible, multi-centered networks. This wasn't decline, it was adaptation, it was resilience. The second transformation is in politics and law. Surviving legal texts show a society of remarkable complexity, where customary law, civic law, and church law coexisted, competed, and overlapped. Commercial courts, city charters, and community rights all reveal that Europe was never lawless. In fact, it was experimenting with different models of order, diversity, that would eventually lay the foundation for nation-states and modern rule of law. Third comes knowledge and creativity. Manuscripts of philosophy, science, and literature show that human curiosity never died. People continued to question, to debate, to experiment, sometimes within the framework of faith, sometimes pushing beyond it. Discussions on reason and belief, humble poems, observations of the stars or of medicine, all point to a period that was not a void of learning, but a vast laboratory of ideas, preserved, reshaped, and waiting to bloom. But perhaps the most profound shift is the human face of this age. Personal letters, travel journals, folk songs, they return to us the voices of ordinary people, not just kings, wars, or plagues, but wives worrying, students complaining, merchants bargaining, peasants singing. These details remind us that history was not only the darkness of catastrophe, but also the light of everyday life. And that light never went out. To rewrite the story means abandoning the tidy narrative, a narrative that prefers simplicity. An empire falls, darkness descends, the Renaissance brings salvation. Instead, we must accept a messier, truer reality. History is never a straight line. It is a tangled web. Some places decline, others flourish. Some years bring suffering, others renewal, and all of it happens at once. Of course, rewriting does not mean denying the real hardships. Disease, war, economic crisis, all of these were real, and they left heavy marks. But alongside loss, there was creativity and adaptation. That is the fuller truth. In every age, humans endure and invent, fail and recover. And here lies the deeper message. The Dark Ages never truly existed as an absolute reality. It was a construct, a lens crafted to glorify the Renaissance and the modern. Remove that lens and we see that history was never truly dark, only that its light was overlooked. From here, we'll turn to each aspect in greater detail: economics, politics, knowledge, religion, and social life. For only by looking closely at each dimension can we uncover the vitality hidden within this much maligned age. And first, let us return to the economy, where texts and artifacts reveal a world far more dynamic, diverse, and surprising than the image of poverty we've long been taught. When we hear the phrase Dark Ages, the picture that usually comes to mind is of a Europe exhausted, fields abandoned, markets deserted, people bent over barren soil, scraping out a meager, self-sufficient existence. It's a monochrome image, painted heavily into textbooks for centuries. But when we piece together evidence from manuscripts, archaeology, and even art, a very different truth emerges. The medieval economy never disappeared. It simply restructured, shifting from an imperial system to a flexible, multi-centered network. After Rome collapsed, it's true that many large cities shrank and imperial roads decayed, but shrinking did not mean silence. Instead of one centralized system ruling the continent, the medieval economy relied on countless local nodes tightly linked by fairs, markets, ports, and caravans. A small market in northern France might trade wheat for salt. A champagne fair could attract merchants from across Europe. A modest port on the Adriatic might serve as a gateway for goods from the east. Up close, these seem like scattered fragments, but in the wide view they form a living network no less vibrant than Rome's. Archaeology reinforces this picture. In 9th century German graves, archaeologists found fine jewellery and imported ceramics. In Scandinavia, Arab coins appear in buried hoards, proving that silver from the south flowed as far as the north. In England, remains show the rise of rural markets where peasants sold surplus and bought essentials. Clearly, the economy was not locked within village borders. It was layered, circulating on many levels. Even agriculture, long portrayed as stagnant, shows strong adaptability. Documents and tools reveal that peasants produced not only for themselves, but also surpluses for trade. Some regions experimented with hardier grain varieties, others expanded cultivation with heavy ploughs and horse-drawn harnesses. Innovations like watermills and windmills gradually appeared, boosting productivity. Rural life, then, was not just endless struggle, it was a slow but steady arena of technological change. Urban growth makes the picture even clearer. Commercial hubs like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and later Bruges and Lübeck became vital arteries of interregional trade. But beyond these giants, countless small towns acted as knots in the web, gathering goods, collecting taxes, hosting fairs. Merchants and townspeople grew into a new class, strong enough to form guilds, demand autonomy, and build town halls. They were the force that transformed Europe from a scattered economy into an urbanized one. The wealth is obvious in art and architecture. Monumental Romanesque churches and soaring Gothic cathedrals could never have been built if society were trapped in bare subsistence. These required money, skill, and manpower, surpluses invested in what was not essential for survival. Stained glass windows, sculpted statues, and commissioned hymns all testify to a society wealthy enough to spend on beauty. Here we also see sharper social stratification. While many peasants lived in hardship, merchants and lords enjoyed luxury. Gold jewelry, ornate weapons, glazed pottery all prove that a consumer class existed, willing and able to buy extravagance. Medieval Europe was not universally poor, but layered, prosperity and scarcity coexisting side by side. One overlooked detail is the rise of credit and finance. By the 11th century, we find evidence of loans, interest, even rudimentary insurance for goods. These practices were not rare exceptions. They became increasingly common in long-distance trade. Though still primitive, they signaled a new economic mindset where signatures and legal commitments were as valuable as physical goods. This was the first step toward banks and modern financial markets. Of course, crises were real: famine, plague, raids. But it was precisely the tension between collapse and growth that forced adaptation. When one region suffered, another compensated. When agriculture faltered, maritime trade expanded. This flexibility gave the medieval economy a remarkable resilience. Viewed in full, the so-called Dark Ages no longer look like a continent smothered in shadow, but like a mosaic. Some regions suffered, but others thrived. Some moments were dark, others radiant. And it was this interplay that fueled Europe's transformation. The medieval economy did not collapse, it changed form, laying the foundations for the explosion of trade, art, and knowledge that would later define the Renaissance. And once we see how the economy functioned, we must ask, who kept order across all these exchanges, contracts, and social ties? The answer lies in a field that may seem dry, but was in fact full of life: law and politics, where order was constantly negotiated, recorded, and remade in the heart of medieval Europe. If the medieval economy proves that the Dark Ages were far from impoverished, then politics and law reveal another truth. Medieval Europe was not a lawless wasteland, but a layered, complex, and experimental political landscape. Legal documents, treaties, and commercial courts show us a world where power didn't rest solely in the hands of kings or popes, but was spread out, contested, and constantly reshaped. After the fall of Rome, central authority did collapse. But that didn't mean order vanished. On the contrary, it opened the door to new political models. In many regions, power shifted into the hands of local lords, forming the web we call feudalism. Yet feudalism was not mere chaos. Land contracts, oaths of loyalty, and records of obligations were all written down. A knight swore fealty to his lord, a peasant pledged to deliver crops, all certified with documents, witnesses, and seals. This was a primitive form of contract law, but strong enough to stabilize society. In the cities, we see a different picture, the rise of urban self-government. Italian communes like Florence, Pisa, and Venice formed citizen councils, issued their own laws, raised militias, and established independent courts. Surviving charters reveal a diversity of power. Townsmen signed treaties with nobles, merchants organized guilds to defend their interests, and in some cases officials were even elected. These were the first steps toward the republican city-states that would deeply influence modern European politics. Medieval diplomacy, too, was more sophisticated than we often imagine. Peace treaties, trade agreements, and military alliances were everywhere. Venice signed accords with Byzantium, Frankish rulers negotiated with the Anglo-Saxons, even small towns forged pacts to safeguard trade routes. Each treaty stands as proof that far from chaos, medieval Europe maintained a kind of early international order, where commitment and negotiation were essential. Law itself was never a single system, but a patchwork of overlapping codes. There was local customary law, feudal law, canon law, and increasingly civic law. Sometimes they clashed, but that very overlap created room for debate and flexibility. A lawsuit might begin in a village court, escalate to a church tribunal, and finally be appealed to a royal court. People learned to navigate these layers, and documents show that ordinary townsfolk sometimes even won cases against nobles or monasteries. Surprisingly, medieval law could also be strikingly humane. An 11th century ruling reduced a poor family's debt so that they might survive. A city statute required bread prices to remain fair to prevent the poor from rioting in hunger. These decisions remind us that law was not only a tool of authority, but also a mechanism of social balance, reflecting concern for the community. Of course, violence and arbitrariness sometimes overpowered the law. Yet, taken as a whole, the surviving records show us this. Medieval society was not legally empty, but an ongoing experiment where communities and institutions competed to create order. And in that competition, the seeds of the modern rule of law state were sown. After seeing how the economy functioned and how politics and law experimented with new forms of order, we're left with another question. If trade remained vibrant and law was sophisticated, could knowledge itself really have been lost in darkness? The answer, drawn from hidden texts and archaeological evidence, is surprising. By the 11th century, knowledge was no longer confined to monasteries. It was beginning to flourish in cities, in schools, and across continents through networks of exchange. The clearest milestone was the birth of the first universities. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, names we associate with centuries of scholarship, didn't appear out of thin air. They grew out of a tradition of debate and teaching that had been building quietly for generations. School statutes from the 12th and 13th centuries describe students gathering around masters, openly questioning and debating philosophy, theology, and law. A lecture was no longer a one-way sermon, it was a dialogue. The teacher posed an argument, students challenged it, and the whole class tested it with reason. That spirit of questioning laid the foundations of modern science, to ask, to debate, and to prove with evidence. This culture of open debate soon shaped a new intellectual ethic. A thesis could not simply be written, it had to be defended before a council, tested under scrutiny. This arena of the mind trained students to reason, argue, and organize thought clearly, skills that became the bedrock of scientific inquiry. Knowledge also bloomed through translation and cross-cultural exchange. Thanks to Muslim centers in Spain and Sicily, Aristotle returned to the West alongside Avicenna's medicine, Averroes's philosophy, and al-Khwarizmi's mathematics, channeled through Arabic to Latin translations. But this was no passive borrowing. A scholar in Paris might read Aristotle in Arabic translation, then immediately write a commentary critiquing him from a Christian perspective. The process of selective adoption, argument, and adaptation created an intellectual current that transcended religious and cultural borders. By the 13th century, scholastic philosophy reached maturity. Where earlier thinkers like Augustine and Anselm had only laid the groundwork for reconciling faith and reason, Thomas Aquinas and his contemporaries built a system. Aquinas used Aristotle to explain Christian doctrine while refining a method of dialectical reasoning. Every claim had to be stated, challenged, and then reinforced with logic. This was not just theology, it was training in structured thought, a method that modern philosophy still inherits. But knowledge wasn't confined to theory. Practical know-how was just as vital. Sketches of architecture, mechanical diagrams, and geometric drawings in craftsmen's notebooks reveal a nameless knowledge alive in the workshops. Building watermills, timber bridges, or Gothic cathedrals required precise calculation and technical skill. This was knowledge outside scholastic books, but essential for daily life, and it paved the way for future inventions. Even in elementary education, traces of logic emerge. In student notebooks, we find basic exercises. If all A are B and all B are C, then all A are C. It looks simple, but it shows that logical reasoning had become foundational in the classroom. In an age once branded as ignorant, these shaky lines are proof that rational thought was quietly taking root. All of this reveals that instead of a void, the Middle Ages were more like a nursery of ideas. Seeds of philosophy, debate, translation, and craft knowledge grew side by side, nourishing each other. When the social and economic conditions were right, they burst into the full forest of the Renaissance. The darkness was only a veil. The light of knowledge had never gone out. It had simply been waiting for the moment to shine. And once we see how powerfully knowledge spread, we can't ignore another force long thought monolithic: religion and spirituality. In reality, the religious life of the Middle Ages was far more colourful, diverse, and conflicted than the image of a Europe uniformly cloaked under the robes of the Church. In the familiar imagination, the Dark Ages are often tied to an image of Europe crushed beneath the absolute authority of the Church, religion imposed from above, clergy controlling thought, and ordinary people living in fear of stern commandments. But when we look again at forgotten manuscripts and archaeological evidence, a different picture emerges. Medieval religious life was anything but uniform. It was rich, layered, and filled with countless voices, rituals, and experiences. It's true that the Roman Catholic Church built an immense network of power, from the Pope in Rome, through bishops and priests, down to the smallest parish. On the surface, this looked like a seamless order. But at the level of individual communities, graves, and manuscripts, diversity is everywhere. First, folk beliefs endured beneath the Christian shell. Archaeology shows that alongside bronze crosses, many graves contained amulets, sun symbols, or objects tied to pagan rituals. In rural villages, people still told stories of forest spirits, wandering souls, and water guardians. these local traditions didn't vanish. They blended into daily religious practice, sometimes even appearing in the margins of holy books as strange little notes. Even within Christianity itself, unity was never absolute. New religious movements sprang up. Some embraced extreme asceticism, others stressed love and compassion, still others pushed spiritual equality. Surviving records also describe heresy trials. To the Church, these were threats. But seen another way, the very frequency of these trials proves that different ideas had spread widely enough to force a reaction from the center. Another key factor was interfaith contact. Through trade and travel, medieval Europe was never closed off. Christians encountered Muslims, Jews, and even distant belief systems. An 11th century Venetian merchant, in a surviving letter, describes being invited to dinner by a Muslim family in Alexandria and marveling at their hospitality and unfamiliar customs. Meanwhile, Jewish communities in cities like Toledo and Mainz thrived as traders and scholars, translating Aristotle and Arabic medicine into Latin, serving as vital cultural bridges. Religious life, in other words, was not just a monologue of the Church, but a dialogue across borders. Perhaps most striking is the personalization of faith. In diaries and manuscripts we find deeply private notes, dreams, doubts, even disappointments. A monk in the 11th century confessed, "I pray, but my heart is still empty." Such words reveal that medieval people weren't simply obedient subjects, they wrestled inwardly, searching for meaning of their own. Even religious art reveals this diversity. A Scandinavian church carved dragons alongside crosses, echoing Norse heritage. In Sicily, churches blended Byzantine, Islamic, and Norman styles into something unique. Frescoes, stone sculptures, stained glass. They carried theology, yes, but also reflected local identity. Faith was never a single color, but always refracted through the lens of culture. Taken together, these fragments show medieval religion as a vibrant mosaic. The authority of the Church existed, but so did the persistence of folk beliefs. Outward unity masked inner variety. Official power coexisted with personal struggle. And this very diversity fueled art, philosophy, and community, making religion one of the most complex driving forces of European history. So instead of a grey, oppressive landscape, the so-called Dark Ages in religion were alive with belief, ritual, and personal experience, interwoven, debated, and shared. And from that spiritual foundation, we now turn to another equally fascinating realm, social structure and freedom, where hidden texts reveal that medieval people had far more room for self-determination than we once imagined. In older textbooks, medieval society is often drawn as a rigid pyramid. At the top, kings and nobles, below them, clergy, then knights, and at the bottom, peasants, very bottom, serfs bound to the land for life. That picture suggests a static, closed world where people had no freedom and no choices. But hidden documents and archaeological evidence are gradually breaking apart that overly simple model. First, not all peasants were serfs. Many surviving land contracts show that there were free peasants, people who rented land, paid taxes or produce, but had the right to leave and move elsewhere. A charter from the 11th century states plainly, "The tenant may return the land and go elsewhere after the harvest." This directly contradicts the idea that all peasants were locked to the soil. Even limited, that freedom of movement was a form of choice. Even among serfs, conditions varied. In some places they owed heavy dues and forced labor. In others, they kept much of their harvest and even took part in village councils to decide local matters. Some records describe villages electing their own headmen, settling disputes before they ever reached a lord or a bishop. These details reveal that medieval society didn't run only from the top down, it also had self-governing structures from the bottom up. Women, too, had more rights than we often assume. Legal texts and trade contracts show widows retaining property and even taking part in business deals. In some Italian cities, women from merchant families signed loan agreements or purchase contracts. In rural communities, women managed land while their husbands were away, and many 11th and 12th century wills show daughters inheriting property. Far from full equality, yes, but still enough to challenge the stereotype of medieval women as completely invisible. Medieval towns created yet another social space. As trade grew, townspeople and merchants rose as a force outside the old three orders of clergy, nobility, and peasantry. Town charters show merchants forming guilds, craftsmen organizing associations, writing their own rules, and defending their rights against both nobles and the church. These were the first steps toward a kind of civil society, where people found collective power beyond the rigid pyramid. Even the knightly class, usually pictured as the nobles' loyal servants, was more fluid. Many knights weren't born noble, some were peasants or townsmen elevated by wealth or military skill. A few became free knights, serving under contract rather than permanent fealty. This created room for social mobility, where individuals could climb by merit or fortune. Another fascinating discovery is the presence of collective rights. Many villages managed shared pastures, forests and ponds. Rights to graze, gather wood, or fish were written into agreements, with penalties for abuse. These commons show that medieval people didn't live only in submission. They knew how to organize and defend community rights. Archaeology adds to the picture. Excavations of 10th and 11th century homes reveal sturdy structures, varied household goods, and even small luxuries. This shows that social hierarchy wasn't absolute. Even within the same village, some families were wealthier, others poorer. And this inequality, paradoxically, created openings for social movement. Of course, the darker side remained. Many still lived under the burdens of serfdom. Many women were excluded from real power. Many communities suffered under oppression. But the coexistence of constraint with freedom, of hierarchy with collective rights, of rigidity with flexibility, proves that medieval society was far more colorful than the old pyramid model suggests. It wasn't only the shadow of oppression, it also carried the light of adaptation and social creativity. If social structures show us how power operated, then daily life brings history back to its most human scale. After all, history isn't written only in wars, treaties, and decrees. It's also written in simple meals, the noise of a crowded market, jokes at a festival, and the small worries of everyday life. Through these fragments, we realize that medieval people did not live in a silent age, but continued to dream, to hope, to fear, and to love, just as we do today. Archaeology has revealed vivid details from ordinary homes. In small kitchens, archaeologists have found worn wooden spoons, darkened ceramic pots, and animal bones still marked with cuts. From these, we know meals were built around grains and vegetables, with meat reserved for holidays, washed down with homemade beer or wine. In wealthier areas, spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger appear, proof that food culture was far from bland and was enriched by trade. Even commercial records note the prices of cheese, barrels of ale, or fees for hiring a baker. Tiny figures that paint a concrete, familiar picture of daily life. Markets were the beating heart of public life. Chronicles, contracts, and travel journals all mention seasonal fairs, which were not just places to trade goods, but also to meet, share news, and even find a spouse. One merchant described the great fair at Champagne. The Italians bring wine, the Flemings bring cloth, the Germans bring iron, and the locals bring honey and cheese. Such scenes conjure up a colorful, bustling world, far removed from the idea of a dark and lifeless Europe. Collective life also shines through folk literature. There were work songs sung in the fields, satirical jokes about gluttonous monks, lullabies with legendary heroes. One manuscript even has a note scribbled in the margin. "Forgive the spelling, my hand shakes from the cold." Just a small complaint, but it brings us face to face with a real person, sitting in a freezing room, hand trembling, yet still determined to record the words of the community. Even in hardship, solidarity was recorded. One chronicle tells, that year the harvest failed, but the villagers shared their grain and no one starved. This isn't just data, it's a human story of community resilience. Some legal records even show village councils intervening to regulate wheat prices and prevent profiteering, an early form of social protection. Festivals and rituals of inversion added another layer of color. On certain days, peasants dressed as nobles, students mocked their teachers, and whole villages sang and danced together. For a moment, social order was turned upside down. That temporary release itself is proof of vitality. Even amid plague and war, people found ways to laugh and push back their fears. A 12th century student's travel diary describes arriving in Paris to study, cramped dormitories, meager meals, yet an electrifying atmosphere of debate with fellow students that left him exhilarated. In those shaky lines, we see a hunger that reached beyond the lot of ordinary life, a hunger to learn, to see more of the world, to change one's destiny. Daily life in the Middle Ages, then, was anything but monotonous. It had worry and want, but also sharing. It knew suffering, but also laughter. It held shadows, but was full of hope. And within that collective picture, history feels closer and more real than ever. A reminder that even in the hardest times, people always found ways to live, to love, and to dream. By now, after exploring hidden texts that reveal the richness of Europe's economy, law, knowledge, religion, and daily life, a bigger question emerges: why do we even call this period the Dark Ages? The truth is, the term wasn't born from the period itself, but from Renaissance and Enlightenment writers, and it reflects a Eurocentric lens, one that placed Europe at the center while ignoring the rest of the world. Once we set Europe alongside its contemporaries, the weakness of that old label becomes clear. While Europe was painted as ignorant and stagnant, the Islamic world was entering a golden age. Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, with its house of wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, became a center of translation and research where Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen were not just studied but expanded upon. Scholars like al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations of algebra. Avicenna wrote the canon of medicine used in Europe for centuries. Averroes debated Aristotle with influence spreading across the Mediterranean. Side by side, it's obvious, what was called Europe's darkness was only one part of the picture, while intellectual light blazed elsewhere. In the East, China under the Tang and Song dynasties reached extraordinary heights. In the 9th century, while European chronicles lamented poor harvests, woodblock printing was already widespread in China, producing books in large numbers. By the 11th century, when Europe was only beginning its first universities, China was using gunpowder, the compass, and movable type printing. These innovations didn't just advance warfare, they expanded trade, spreading along the Silk Road and shaping the wider world. In South Asia, India under the Guptas and later kingdoms left a legacy of philosophy, mathematics, and art. The concept of zero, the decimal system, and Buddhist and Hindu philosophical texts continued to circulate during the very centuries when Europe was supposedly asleep. Indian merchants remained central to the Indian Ocean trade, carrying goods and ideas to Arabia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Even in the Americas, the later Maya civilization built magnificent cities, developed sophisticated astronomy, and maintained complex calendars. Though many cities declined in the 9th and 10th centuries, the remains proved this was no dark society, but a high civilization undergoing its own transformations. In Africa, the Ghana Empire, 9th to 11th centuries, controlled the trade of gold and salt, anchoring a wealthy network that stretched from the Sahara to the Mediterranean. Islamic writers describe its riches in awe, with gold so abundant it stunned foreign visitors. While Europe is often painted as poor, Africa was already an economic hub. Seen in full, the phrase "Dark Ages" only makes sense if we project from a narrow view, placing Europe at the center and disregarding all else. But in a global frame, we see a multipolar world, Europe restructuring, Islam and China flourishing, India and Africa powering vast trade networks, the Americas sustaining great cities and sciences. The world was never dark, it was a shifting constellation of lights. More importantly, this comparison helps us break the Eurocentric bias. It reminds us that history has never had a single center. If we only look at Europe, we might imagine a gap in knowledge. But when we widen the view, we see a world in motion, different civilizations rising, exchanging, and innovating side by side. Europe, even in its struggles, remained a link in this global chain. And this lesson matters not only for the past, but for the present. History and the world today are always diverse and multipolar. No single center monopolizes the light. Every civilization has its moments of brilliance and decline. Understanding this frees us from the shadow of a dark age that was never truly global, but only the invention of a narrow lens. From this global comparison, we now return to Europe to look closely at one special case, the Byzantine Empire and the early Islamic world, two centers of power and knowledge that stood strong, directly challenging the idea that the entire world had fallen into darkness. Once we step outside the Eurocentric lens, the map of the medieval world changes instantly. While Western Europe was labeled dark, right beside it, two great centers of power and knowledge shone brightly. The Byzantine Empire in the east and the early Islamic world stretching from Spain to Persia. Neither merely preserved civilization, they became global conduits of knowledge, keeping the flame of the classical past alive and preparing the fuel for Europe's eventual revival. Take Byzantium first, the Eastern Roman Empire that endured for more than 1,000 years after the fall of the West. Its capital, Constantinople, with impregnable walls and a strategic location, was not just a military fortress but a thriving hub of economy and culture. Surviving chronicles, laws, and art reveal a society far from darkness. The solidus coin remained stable, trade across the Black Sea, and Mediterranean flourished, and the court maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy. The Justinian Code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the backbone of later European law. This was not collapse, it was structured continuity. Byzantium also safeguarded and expanded classical learning. In the libraries of Constantinople, the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates were copied and taught. Byzantine scholars didn't merely preserve, they wrote commentaries, developed theology, philosophy, and science further. While Western Europe was still struggling to rebuild order, Byzantium stood as an intellectual bridge to the East, ensuring that knowledge would one day return westward through waves of translation. Meanwhile, the early Islamic world erupted like a whirlwind. From the 8th to the 11th centuries, a golden age took shape. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became global centers of learning. Contemporary sources describe an astonishing openness, Greek philosophy translated into Arabic, Indian mathematics absorbed, local knowledge expanded into new systems. Al-Khwarizmi founded algebra. Avicenna wrote The Canon of Medicine, a cornerstone for centuries. Averroes reinterpreted Aristotle with influence spanning the Mediterranean. Al-Biruni explored astronomy and science in ways that prefigured modern inquiry. Far from simply preserving, the Islamic world was inventing. Crucially, these centers connected global knowledge. From China, they adopted paper and revolutionized book production. From India, they took the concept of zero and the decimal system, opening a new mathematical era. From Greece they absorbed philosophy and science, then critiqued, refined, and passed them back to Europe. Without this Islamic bridge, it's no exaggeration to say Europe would have lacked the intellectual raw material for its renaissance. One place makes this clear: Córdoba in Islamic Spain, an island of light right within Europe. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, while northern monasteries often preserved only dozens. Jews, Muslims, and Christians worked side by side, translating, debating, and compiling. Later, Latin manuscripts carried from Córdoba into France and Italy opened a new intellectual current. This alone proves that darkness never covered the continent entirely. There were oases of brilliance alive within it. The parallel strength of Byzantium and the Islamic world shows us plainly: history cannot be reduced to a single global night. While Western Europe was restructuring, the East and the Mediterranean South remained prosperous, creative, and intellectually alive. Look wider, and the label dark collapses. It was dark only from one narrow angle, while from another it blazed with light. And once we see this, the need to rewrite history becomes undeniable. The story is not of one center falling into darkness and then rising again, but of many centers coexisting, declining, flourishing, and reshaping one another. From here, our journey turns back westward to trace how, even in Western Europe, the legacy of Rome never fully disappeared, but continued to live on in new and unexpected forms. When we look at Byzantium and the early Islamic world, it's clear that the light of power and knowledge never went out after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But even within Western Europe itself, the very place long thought drowned in darkness, the legacy of Rome never truly vanished. The empire collapsed, yes, but its imprint lived on in law, language, infrastructure, and in the collective memory of medieval people. One of the clearest continuities was Roman law. Even though the imperial bureaucracy had dissolved, many of its legal principles endured. Legal documents from the 6th to 9th centuries show that basic concepts, inheritance rights, property ownership, contractual obligations, remained in use. The Salic law of the Franks, or the Anglo-Saxon and Lombard codes, all bear traces of Roman influence, blended with local custom into hybrid systems. Reading these texts, we realize Rome did not die. It adapted under new disguises. Language tells the same story. Latin remained the tongue of the church, of scholarship and of law. It connected distant regions into a common intellectual world, yet at the same time it mixed with local dialects, giving birth to new vernaculars: French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. Even today, when we speak those languages, we are speaking the airs of Rome. The empire may have fallen, but its soul, the Latin tongue, never went silent. Infrastructure, too, carried Rome's shadow. Roman roads, though worn, still served for travel and trade. Bridges, aqueducts, and drainage systems survived, shaping how people organized their landscapes. A monastery chronicle from the 8th century records peasants reusing stones from Roman ruins to build new churches, proof that Rome still lived, quite literally, in every brick. The Roman legacy also survived in the very idea of the state. Though new barbarian kingdoms took power, many rulers cloaked themselves in Roman imagery to claim legitimacy. When Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800, his ambition was not just conquest, it was to present himself as Caesar's rightful heir. Rome, as an ideal, remained a powerful anchor, invoked by dynasty after dynasty. Religion carried the Roman thread as well. Early Romanesque churches were built directly on the basilica model. Mosaics, so common in the empire, continued to shine in cathedrals and palaces. Even Roman agricultural festivals were Christianized, but retained their folk spirit. Christianity in the Middle Ages was not a foreign replacement. It absorbed and reshaped Rome's traditions into a new identity. And medieval people themselves were acutely aware of this past. In countless manuscripts, monks and scholars invoked the Imperium Romanum as a presence both distant and close. To them, Rome was not a dead past. It was a living memory, a reference point for comparison, for longing, and for claiming continuity. In truth, the so-called Dark Ages were not an absolute break after Rome. They were a period of transformation when the fragments of empire were restructured into new forms. Rome never disappeared. It lived on in every document, every road, every custom, and in the political dreams of rulers. And it was precisely this continuity that allowed Europe, when the Renaissance came, to revive Rome, because Rome had never completely left them. From here, we turn to one pillar in particular, the institution that most powerfully preserved Rome's memory and knowledge, the monasteries and the church. Far from being merely conservative or repressive, they were enduring lamps of light, keeping knowledge alive through chaos and ensuring that the legacy of Rome still burned into the medieval age. In popular imagination, the church is often seen only as a symbol of conservatism and repression. But when we look closer at surviving texts and material evidence, a far more complex reality emerges. In a Europe fractured politically, monasteries and the church became its most enduring pillars, preserving memory, community, and spiritual life from complete collapse. First, monasteries played an undeniable role in organizing local communities. As central governments crumbled, monasteries became places of refuge and relief. Chronicles record them opening granaries during famines, helping villages recover after raids, even rebuilding bridges and roads after wars. Local parishes, too, did far more than perform rituals. Priests often acted as mediators in disputes, as record keepers of events, and as teachers of basic Latin to children. In a world without the guiding hand of the state, the church's network became a substitute skeleton, connecting millions of people through shared rules and practices. Monasteries were also economic centers. They didn't just pray, they farmed fields, raised livestock, brewed beer, and cultivated vineyards for wine. Legal documents show they hired workers, traded goods, and even lent money. In doing so, monasteries sustained local populations while accumulating resources to build churches and repair infrastructure. Surviving complexes, from Cluny in France to Monte Cassino in Italy, prove that if Europe had truly sunk into total poverty, such grand projects could never have been built. The church also preserved a common language and culture. While local dialects evolved into French, Italian, German, and others, Latin remained the shared medium of law, scholarship, and worship. Thanks to this unity, a scholar in Ireland could correspond with a colleague in Italy, and a manuscript from Spain could be read in England. Without this Latin foundation sustained by the Church, Europe could not have rediscovered the cultural cohesion it needed to enter the Renaissance. Religious art and architecture added another dimension. Romanesque and Gothic churches, with their soaring vaults and radiant stained glass, were not only houses of prayer, but also cultural centers. They served as stone books teaching scripture to the illiterate, and as monuments of collective artistry that embodied humanity's drive to reach higher. These works directly contradict the notion of a dark and stagnant Europe, showing instead its ability to mobilize resources and fuel artistic creativity. Of course, the darker side of the Church is also real. It sometimes imposed doctrine, controlled belief, and prosecuted heresy. Yet ironically, even in doing so, it left behind records that preserved the very diversity of thought it tried to suppress. Heresy trials and bans in their detail kept alive ideas that might otherwise have been erased. Taken together, monasteries and the Church formed the backbone of medieval Europe, sustaining communities, nurturing economies, unifying culture, and inspiring art. Thanks to them, Rome's memory was not lost. Thanks to them, fragments of civilization did not scatter into darkness, but were preserved, waiting for the right moment to blossom again. And from this solid foundation, the green shoots of knowledge, art, and society found fertile ground, preparing for the great transformations of the Renaissance. One of the clearest green shoots of renewal was education. Schools attached to churches and monasteries, at first intended only for training priests, gradually expanded to teach literacy to ordinary children. A text from 11th century Chartres describes a class where peasant children were taught basic Latin. The curriculum was simple, but it marked the beginning of a lasting tradition of schooling. From there, centres of learning grew larger and eventually became the universities of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, the nuclei of Western education. Another green shoot was art. The heavy-walled Romanesque churches with their narrow windows, followed by the soaring Gothic cathedrals with radiant stained glass, testified not only to economic and religious strength, but to a restless creative spirit that went far beyond preservation. Frescoes, sculptures, and stained glass panels didn't only illustrate the Bible, they also showed daily life, peasants harvesting, blacksmiths working, children playing. Far from silent, medieval art was alive, preparing the ground for the Renaissance explosion of beauty. In philosophy and thought, debates between reason and faith became a tradition. The writings of Anselm and later Abelard show attempts to prove God through logic, paving the way for scholastic theology. These early efforts, though rooted in religion, created a method of dialectical reasoning, the very tool that European philosophy and science would later inherit. It's no exaggeration to say that in the so-called darkness, people were learning to argue, reason, and question, the core acts of science itself. Even in social life, the sprouts of change were visible. The rise of the Champagne fairs, where merchants from across Europe gathered, not only created vast trade networks but also laid the foundation for urban culture. Small towns evolved into guild centres where craftsmen organised themselves, set professional rules, and defended their rights. The first guild charters reveal the birth of a civic consciousness, independent of nobles and the church, an important step in social development. The shoots also appeared in literature and language. Old French songs, Anglo-Saxon ballads, and German legends committed to writing show vernacular languages beginning to enter literature. This trend paved the way for national literatures, preparing the stage for Dante, Chaucer, and Cervantes. In other words, the rise of the vernacular signaled a cultural transformation that would endure. Some manuscripts even show the stirrings of scientific thought. Astronomical records made for fixing religious festivals slowly turned into more precise observations of planetary movement. Medical texts no longer repeated Galen word for word. They included local herbal remedies and first-hand experiments. Notes on mechanical toys and architectural sketches demonstrate that technical intelligence was alive, laying groundwork for the great inventions of the later Middle Ages. Most important of all, these green shoots were never separate from daily life. They arose from real needs: education to teach literacy, laws to regulate trade, art to bind communities, medicine to heal, philosophy to answer doubts. Because they were rooted in everyday necessity, they endured. And that is why a few centuries later, when conditions ripened, these shoots blossomed into the flourishing forest of the Renaissance. Looking back, the Dark Ages were not an empty void. They were more like a long winter where seeds lay hidden beneath the soil. From above, all seemed still. But underneath, life continued, preparing for spring. And manuscripts, artifacts, and everyday records prove it, that winter did not kill intelligence, it only covered it, until the day it rose again, stronger than before. And now, as our story nears its conclusion, and as new evidence forces modern historians to rewrite the very idea of the Dark Ages, debate and disagreement naturally follow, because history is never just a pile of data. It is how we interpret that data the frame we place it in, and the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Here we see history's other face. It is not a neutral report, but an ongoing, sometimes tense, dialogue among competing perspectives. One group of scholars stresses that despite signs of vitality, decline was very real. They point to the collapse of Roman urban infrastructure, amphitheaters abandoned, roads falling into disrepair, cities shrinking. They cite chronicles of famine, plague, and depopulation. For them, you cannot dismiss widespread suffering and loss simply because we found a few peppercorns in a grave or a handful of copied manuscripts. In this view, darkness is not absolute, but a shorthand for genuine crisis. Others argue the opposite, that the very label Dark Ages was flawed from the start. History, they remind us, is never one-dimensional. Yes, there was loss, but alongside it came continuity, creativity, and change. To call it dark is to deny the centuries in which people still farmed, traded, wrote letters, composed poems, and observed the stars. That label is not only unfair to the past, it distorts how we understand human progress. Instead of darkness, they propose we see it as a transitional period, an early Middle Ages with its own distinct character, not to be unfairly measured against Rome or the Renaissance. Between these poles lies a rich field of debate. Some scholars adopt a regional approach, acknowledging that some areas fell into deep decline, like Britain after Rome's withdrawal, while others thrived, such as Italy or Spain, connected to the Islamic world. Others emphasize the global context. Can we really call the 7th to 10th centuries dark when China, India, and the Islamic world were at their peaks? The real issue, they argue, is not whether the age was dark or bright, but whether we can widen our lens to embrace a multipolar view. The debate also extends to storytelling. Should we still use Dark Ages as a metaphor for decline because it's vivid, easy to grasp, and pedagogically useful? Or should we abandon it entirely since it carries Eurocentric prejudice and erases richness? Some teachers still use the term, but with disclaimers, as a way to teach students critical reflection. Others have dropped it altogether, replacing it with early Middle Ages. This is not just a scholarly quarrel, but a negotiation over language itself, because language shapes thought. New discoveries from modern science only sharpen these tensions. When AI deciphers a manuscript, when archaeology uncovers new finds, each revelation is interpreted in different ways. One historian may see it as proof of continuity, another may call it an exception against a backdrop of decline. This very divergence shows that history never ends with a discovery, it only opens up new layers of debate. And that, in the end, is what gives history life. Debate is not a sign of chaos, it is evidence of vitality. History is never a fixed story, it is always being retold, questioned, and challenged. And far from weakening the discipline, this makes it stronger, for each perspective forces us to look harder, to ask more, to resist the comfort of easy assumptions. At a deeper level, these debates touch on cultural identity. If we admit that the Dark Ages was a myth invented to glorify the Renaissance, then we must also admit that much of Europe's self-story was built on a false contrast. That reshapes not only history, but Europe's understanding of itself in the wider world. And while that unsettles some conservative scholars, others welcome it as a chance to free historical imagination from old ruts. In the end, we see clearly disagreement and debate are not weaknesses, but the very heartbeat of history. History has never been about uncovering a single, absolute truth. It has always been about widening our horizons again and again. After all the fierce debates, a larger question arises: how many secrets of the so-called Dark Ages still remain hidden? Because if just a handful of manuscripts, trade contracts, or personal letters were enough to shake the old picture of history, we must wonder what power still lies in the pages left unread, in the soil beneath our feet, or even in familiar buildings whose walls may yet conceal untold stories. The first thing to remember is the sheer mass of material still untouched. Monasteries, cathedrals, and royal archives across Europe still hold millions of manuscripts, many never studied in depth. The Vatican alone has miles of shelving packed with documents, some unopened since the 17th century. Among them are countless medieval copies containing details of daily life, law, and knowledge that could transform our understanding of an entire age. Then there are the palimpsests, parchments, scraped and written over, that remain in abundance. With multispectral imaging, researchers uncover new layers every year. Today it might be a marginal note on Aristotle, but tomorrow it could be a completely lost work or a forgotten personal diary. Surprises lie just beneath the ink, waiting for technology to bring them to light. Archaeology, too, has only scratched the surface. Many medieval cities still lie beneath modern streets. Every excavation reveals more: markets, homes, tools. In York, waterlogged soil preserved wooden objects, grains of wheat, even traces of fertilizer, priceless data for reconstructing everyday life. In Germany, recent digs have uncovered drainage systems and public baths that lasted far longer than we once thought. Each new site strikes another blow against the old image of poverty and stagnation. And the hidden evidence isn't confined to Europe. How many artifacts from China, India, or the Islamic world still lie scattered in European ports? How many traces of intercontinental trade remain buried? A shard of Chinese porcelain in Venice, an Islamic coin in England, a Byzantine pendant in Scandinavia. Each small object can redraw the map of global commerce, and surely many such pieces remain undiscovered. New technology is opening further doors. Ancient DNA research, barely 2 decades old, has already rewritten our knowledge of plague. Satellite imagery and AI are revealing the outlines of forgotten cities beneath forests and farmland. Radiocarbon and isotope analysis continue to sharpen our dating. This means that every year medieval history has the chance to be rewritten, not through massive revolutions, but through the steady accumulation of small discoveries. What makes this so compelling is that we cannot predict where the next breakthrough will come from. A forgotten manuscript may shed new light on astronomy. An excavation may reveal a medieval city larger than anyone imagined. Or fresh evidence may force us to rethink Europe's relationship with other civilizations, perhaps proving that its borrowings from Arabia and India ran deeper than we knew. Each possibility is like a branch waiting to reach into the sunlight. And that is why the Dark Ages are not a closed chapter, but an open file. They are like a thick book with many pages still stuck together. Each new discovery peels one more page apart, letting us read further, see more, understand better. And in that process we learn that history is not a fixed wall but a woven fabric, capable of being patched, rethreaded, or even rewoven entirely. And now, as we come to the final moments of this episode, it's just you and me, sitting together in a quiet pause. Looking back, we can recognize a truth. The Dark Ages never really existed in the way we were taught. Yes, there were wars, plagues, ruined cities, and hard lives, but alongside all that there were bustling trade routes, carefully written laws, seeds of knowledge sprouting, works of art created, and a rich landscape of faith. Darkness, then, was never the absence of light. It was only a moment when the light was hidden, waiting patiently for us to uncover it. The greatest lesson from this so-called darkness is human resilience in the face of crisis. The monks who copied texts in the cold, the merchants who risked their lives at sea, the peasants who shared their grain so no one would starve, the scholars who debated philosophy in cloisters, all of them prove that people never surrendered to circumstance, Even as empires fell and infrastructure crumbled, human beings still found ways to preserve order, guard memory, create art, and nurture hope. That tenacity, that quiet current beneath the surface, could never be extinguished, no matter how many layers of prejudice tried to cover it. Darkness, then, was never a curse of history, but a metaphor for challenge. It reminds us that every civilization faces decline, but within the rubble, new seeds always take root. Winters may be long, but spring never vanishes. Seen this way, history offers us a timeless lesson. Humanity may stumble, but it never falls silent. It may lose much, but it always keeps memory. It may suffer, but it still sows hope for tomorrow. And when we understand this, we begin to see history differently. No longer as a simple clash of light and shadow, but as a complex tapestry where both are interwoven into intricate patterns. History teaches us not only about the past, but about how to see the present, that even in crisis there is room for creativity, and the endurance of the human spirit always finds a way forward. But this journey doesn't end here, because once we question the idea of the Dark Ages, we are compelled to question the very way we tell history. If an entire millennium could be mislabeled, how many other chapters are still waiting to be rewritten? How many manuscripts remain undeciphered? How many artifacts lie buried? How many memories still rest in the shadows of archives or in the collective imagination itself? It is this unknown that makes history so compelling. It is not a closed book, but a manuscript left open with many pages still stuck together. Every generation, every new discovery adds a sentence, erases another, and enriches the shared story of humankind. And that is why we must keep curiosity alive. Curiosity is the flame that never dies, the spark that drives us to dig deeper, listen more carefully, and never be satisfied with a single explanation. History, in the end, is not an answer, it is a search. An endless journey where every discovery only opens the door to more questions. So as we close the chapter on the Dark Ages, we are not truly ending. We are only pausing, taking a deep breath, looking up at the pages still unwritten, and asking ourselves how much more light is still waiting to be found in the shadows of history.